What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Book Binge on the King Crusoe YouTube channel. This week is episode 24, and this time we are covering The Wastelands by Stephen King, book 3 in the Dark Tower series. Now, it's been a hot minute since I read this book. It's been since, I don't know, when did I read this? It would have been in March or something like that, so it's been a little while. It's also been a fair bit of time since I recorded any of my other Dark Tower reviews, those being on the Gunslinger and the Drawing of the Three. And here it is in late June now recording this video, so forgive me if I'm get a little bit of things and references wrong. It shouldn't be a problem, but just a little bit of warning. Also, don't worry, there's not going to be another gap like there was in between Drawing of the Three and the Wastelands. For any of the other Dark Tower reviews, I'm going to be covering almost all of the rest of the Dark Tower books in August. The final two reviews will be in September. I'm not sure when I'm going to do the full series ranking and review and something like that. I'll have to figure that out, especially since I plan to do a couple other special things with the series before I do that. But either way, there's not going to be a huge gap between the rest of these reviews. I just want to get them out. So there's going to be a lot of Dark Tower content, especially over next month. But I don't really have that much else to say here in the beginning, so let's talk about some of the best elements of the Wastelands. So, if I'm going to just be straight with you guys, I think most everything in this book deserves to belong in this section, the best elements, because everything about this book almost is incredible, the first half especially. Something that I found particularly cool in the first half was the fact that The Drawing of the Three, the second book in the series, introduces a pretty major problem where a character doesn't die when he's supposed to, and it produces not a time loop, but a paradox. And I think that the way that this book, The Wastelands, addresses and especially resolves that paradox within those characters is incredible. I'm not going to say what happens, obviously, because it's rather complex. It takes up pretty much the first half of this 600-page book, but I thought it was handled incredibly well. Basically, the whole first half of the book is dedicated to resolving this, and I just thought it worked so well. Like I said, first half, basically perfect, in my personal opinion. In fact, up to the point of reading this book, I was like, well, this is easily my favorite thing that I've read this year, being the first half of The Wastelands. And since then, I've read some other things that I enjoy a lot more, but up to that point in March, I hadn't read basically anything since I started reading again back in 2021 that was like, I'm having a really good time with this. I zoomed through the first half of this book in just a couple days because of it. It's also really nice as well, this is something that I just kind of remembered, is that it also allows for a lot of character growth within one of the characters that is introduced in Drawing of the Three, that being Eddie. Eddie sees a whole lot of growth in the first half of this book in some ways, and the rest of that you get to see a little bit towards the end of this book, but it's mostly in the beginning of the next one. But there's some things that King does with Eddie's character that I think works really well, especially in context with the resolution of the paradox for the whole first half of this book. And then the second half of The Wastelands, I think, is also pretty great, as the explicit journey to the Dark Tower is the specific goal for that part of the book. The trip to Lud and a temporary stop in a small town before getting to Lud was great for some character work as well, since I just mentioned some of that. But everything that takes place in Lud, in my opinion, was really good. There's instance where the characters of the quartet are split a little bit, and a kind of double story happens. Two plot lines, two threads happening at the same time, which in a way is also actually pretty similar to the first half, because the first half had a double story going on as well. It was just really satisfying the way that King handled all of this coming together. And it all culminated in a very satisfying ending, the way that those characters and the groups are brought back together at the very end, right before the climax of the book, which, for reference, the climax of the book is pretty much the last page. The meeting of this train, even though the train looks nothing like what he's described in the book. I still love this art, though. It's really cool. But the meeting of Blaine, the train, who is a pain, is also surprisingly climactic for the different characters in the journey. But now we move on to what I think are some of the worst elements. What I just commented on was how some of the culmination of the climactic sequence happens and how I enjoy it. But there's also a problem that I have with this book. Probably the biggest problem with it, just objectively speaking, is the ending. Now, this isn't because the ending of the book is bad in and of itself, the way that a lot of people like to criticize King for being incapable of writing good endings or something like that, which I disagree with up to this point. But the problem that I have with it is because it doesn't end where it should have. Now, this is something that I think many people, especially those who have know a little bit about King, are aware of, that King wrote these books kind of like when the wind blows, as he put it in the coda to Song of Susanna. And I guess when he got to this very end point of the Wastelands, right before what should really have been the climax of this book, I guess he just felt like that's where he needed to end the book. And then he just didn't feel the wind blowing, so to speak, to write the next book for several more years. The thing is that basically the entirety of part one of Wizard and Glass, which is the next book, continues this exact thing, like right from the very second, to the point that the prologue to Wizard and Glass is literally just the very end of the Wastelands, like word for word. It's just restated. And I found that to be rather like, why? If you were going to do this, why didn't you just put the beginning of Wizard and Glass at the end of this? Because as good as most of this book is, it definitely feels a little bit weird to have it just stop pretty much completely unresolved at the entire end of it. Something that a lot of fans wrote letters to King about as the series was being written. I think that there was good reason for people to complain about that because it just feels so weird and kind of pointless to do it this way. It's not necessarily objectively, well, I kind of said that it was objectively bad earlier, but it's not like a horrible thing to do. But I definitely do not think that the book should have been cut where it was. Like, if there was a way to make pretty much the entirety of part one of Wizard and Glass and tack that onto the end of this instead, this book would have been all the better for it. And I think, to an extent, which I'll get to in the Wizard and Glass review, I think even that book would have been better for that as well. But other than that pretty major gripe for me, there is another minor problem that I have with this book. That being the fact that it's called The Wastelands with a cover of a train, Blaine, on it. But despite this fact, there sure is a heck of a lot of not very much wastelands or train in the book. Like, it's literally just a couple dozen pages of it at the very end, and like I said, it cuts off in a really bad spot that the beginning of Wizard of Glass should have just been put into this book instead. It just feels super weird. Like, if Blaine is going to be on the cover of the book and it's going to be called The Wastelands, why is it 600 pages and Blaine and the Wastelands only take up like the final sixth of the book or less? It just doesn't make much sense to me. As I've suggested, would have also been this problem would have just not existed if part one of book four was at the end of this, the way that I think it should be, but I digress. I think it really says a lot about the book that the biggest problems that I have with it is just the fact that the beginning of the next book should have been at the end of this one instead, because a lot of people put The Wastelands as their favorite book in the series, as far as I've heard, and I think there's a lot of good reason for that. There's a lot to love about it. The first half of the book was one of my favorite reading experiences of the year up to that point, and even now I still remember the first half of this thing incredibly fondly, as now at this point in time at recording, I've read six, or rather seven of the eight books. The last book that I'm on is The Dark Tower, the finale. But yeah, overall, I was really excited to read this book when I finished Drawing of the Three, just the way that Drawing of the Three ended was like, I've got to read the next book now. And I would say that this overall satisfied. It took me a little bit to get around to, but it did read really quick overall for everything that happens and for how relatively large it is. This is where the series really started to shine for me. Like I said in that review, and as I've kind of talked about in this video, sort of a little bit, Drawing of the Three was good. In fact, it was great. A lot of people who don't put this as their favorite book put Drawing of the Three as their favorite book instead. But this one, outside of the whole ending being cut in a really weird spot issue, is worth all of the praise it receives, in my opinion. And even despite it being a pretty common pick for the favorite book in the series, that didn't actually stop me from being excited and hopeful for future books. And I would say that that open-minded approach made several of the more future books land a lot better for me than I think some of them did for some other people, and I'm excited to review those a lot over the next month, because I will be covering Wizard and Glass in just a few weeks from now. But until then, this is the end of this review. I've got a review for Dune by Frank Herbert coming out next week, so be sure to subscribe for that, and then check out seasonalproductions.com. Newly renovated. I rebuilt most of the pages basically from the ground up, all things considered. And you can check out that for a backlog of all of my video content and all of my writing as well. So stick around for all sorts of stuff, particularly Dark Tower reviews to come in the future, and I'll be back again in the next video.